As a soybean extensionist in Pennsylvania, I'm always asking farmers this question: what is the biggest factor that is limiting your soybean yields? And usually the first thing I hear is weeds or diseases. It usually takes a while until somebody comes up and says, oh yeah, drought stress, and sometimes flooding as well. Well, it turns out that in rain-fed soybean systems like those that we have in Pennsylvania, the biggest yield limiting factor is water, either too much water or too little water. We tend to forget about this because in rain-fed systems, there's not much we can do about water, right? Well, we have no irrigation and we have no tile drainage, but some of us have cover crops, or we might be able to plant a cover crop. And we can manage that cover crop to make our soils wetter or drier for our soybeans. So how does that work? Well, when we have a cover crop growing in the field, it is taking up water. So it's helping to dry that soil ahead of soybean planting. And then when we terminate that cover crop, that biomass, that cover crop biomass stays in the soil surface, and it acts as a mulch and keeps our soil moist for the soybeans. Now, that effect of cover crop termination time on soil moisture depends a lot on when we terminate that cover crop. So in this illustration that we see here, the cover crops were terminated ahead of soybean planting, maybe a few weeks before soybean planting. And this is a pretty common practice. Now, in this case, those effects of cover crop on soil moisture are pretty small. Now, if we delay that cover crop termination until it's time to plant the soybeans, then those effects are going to be a lot more dramatic. The cover crops will grow longer, and they will take up more water when they're growing. The soil will be drier by the time it's time for us to plant the soybeans. And then later, we'll have more biomass, and that mulch will also be stronger and last longer into the soybean season, and will help us conserve more soil moisture during the soybean growth later in the soybean season. So that practice of delayed termination is also referred to as planting green. And we can see here in this picture what this looks like. We're literally planting into our soybeans into a living green cover crop. So now that we know how cover crop termination time affects soil moisture, we can use that to make decisions on when we want to kill that cover crop. So for example, I would give preference to planting green instead of killing my cover crops ahead of time in cases where I really want to dry that soil ahead of soybean planting. So for example, if I have wet springs or low-lying fields, sometimes the temperature is warm enough for me to go out and plant my soybeans, but the soil is just too wet. Well, in that case, delaying that termination will help to dry the soil and will allow me to go out there and plant my soybeans earlier. Another case where planting green might be helpful is when we're experiencing those drought stress later in the season, in cases where I really want to conserve soil moisture later in the season. One example is when we're always experiencing drought stress around July, August. Also, when we have wider row spacings, like in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of 30-inch soybeans. In that case, we never get a full canopy closure, so we're always left with a strip of bare soil, and we're losing a lot of water. The water is evaporating from that strip. In that case, planting green can help with keeping the soil moist in between the rows, and so we're conserving more soil water in that part. Now, I want to make the point that while in this presentation we talked a lot about soil moisture, the cover crop termination time affects several other factors aside from that. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're considering when is the best time to kill our cover crops. Now that said, soil moisture plays a big role and is a big driver of soybean yields in rain-fed systems. So it is an important consideration.